This is David Alan Grier from The Known World. For this special multimedia edition of Computer, I was asked to give you a little bit of a tour behind The Known World. How I get the ideas and pull together the stories and ask what are the issues that are affecting computing and the community that is engaged in developing computing technologies. What exactly is The Known World? Well, it's a story, but it's a story with a question, perhaps a little history, some policy, of course. Certainly, we're going to have some technology in it, and a little bit of current events. It often starts with something odd that just captures my attention. If you look here on the right, you have a picture of a valve. It's taken on the bluffs in Santa Monica. I'm sure many of you have walked this path before. I was interviewing an engineer about his career and asked what he had done in terms of developing computation for the U.S. government. As we went through the story and talked about the different aspects, he stopped at one moment and said, "Oh yes, and I saved the Los Angeles basin." What, I said? "You know those little valves that stick out all up and down the coastline?" Well, I wasn't sure about that, so I said, "Okay." He said, "We put those in. They pump water into it, fresh water. It's usually recycled sewage that's not quite potable yet. This forms," he said, "a barrier between the salt water of the ocean and the fresh water of the valley, and protects the inland water supply." And so there I was, with a bit of a story and a bit of an idea. And so this is the kind of thing that becomes the known world. Often, the most common starting place for me is this screen, the IEEE Digital Library. In building the known world, I really try to use the tools that we have invented to explore the world that we have created. I've spent a lot of time in libraries and know that electronic technology has really changed the way we think about our cultural heritage. This column, though, the one that will be out in the current issue, started when I discovered completely by happenstance a book on suggestion systems. It had an old binding, and I said, I wonder what this is. And I picked it up, and I realized in a second that this was something about gathering data from employees, from customers, and it was doing this at a period before we had a lot of the computer systems that now do it for us, and that they were thinking about some of the same problems we face and some of the same issues. So immediately I took it home and asked the question, how does this relate to what we're doing now? Well, that usually involves going back to that digital library and probing through and say, what are similar concepts? Where do I find these ideas repeated? Now, in terms of the computing literature, as I see it, the central backbone are the conferences. That's where the new ideas come out, and that's this rolling tide of literature that comes out almost undigested. For years and years, it was the Joint Computer Conference, and I'd have to go into the basement of the library and pull out these old paper archives. Well, they're all now online, and you can search them quickly and find these papers that unfold the basic concepts of computation, of software, languages, of operating systems, of graphics. Step by step, they just unfold before you. And working through these, you could find this wonderful arc. Conferences present ideas in chaos. Ideas are just snippets in papers, a paragraph here, an abstract there. And then as the conference progresses, every now and then you see a key paper, an idea that starts to shape it. And finally, after you get enough of the key papers, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, a field stabilizes and you have this literature that starts to pick up the pieces. Well, once you've gone through conferences that seem relevant for an idea, you push back and you look at transactions. Transactions are an interesting beast. They are far more formal than conferences. Conference papers tend to have a lot of background slammed down in almost a rote way, and then 2 or 3 paragraphs describing the idea and then running off into speculation. Transactions tend to be polished. They do a more careful job of developing the experimental framework and a much clearer job of speculating where the research might lead. The magazines are useful too, and of course I have a deep love for them because I was, for 4 years, the editor-in-chief of one. They're often the quickest introduction to an issue. You find a special issue on your subject, and bang, that will give you all you need to know to get started. Teaches you the basic themes, but magazines are different. They're there to teach you. And sometimes they hide the hard problems. And you find yourself going back and forth, magazine to transaction to conference, until you find the ideas that you need. Well then, you get a pile of information, and what do? The goal is to make it human, to make it engaging, to make people be able to see themselves in it. So you write, which means you sit in front of a screen and ponder. And as you ponder, slowly, somehow, a human face starts to come behind it. And you start asking, how do these people work? What are they thinking about? And, thank God for students, often some student comes to mind who has done something similar, has a quirky story that I can tell about them, or something that's there that illustrates it. This photograph is the roof of my dear friend Doug the rocket scientist's house. It is his solar roof that he raised one December in what can only be described as a communal barn raising. Doug was a wonderful source of many stories. We would go and argue about the future of engineering, what he was doing, his ideas for the future, and his deep concern, as we all have, that while we are taking 2 steps ahead, we introduce something that takes us a step backwards at the same time. So that led me back to the suggestion system, and I quickly found that there was nothing of similar import in much of the periodicals. There were some discussions, but nothing that found useful. However, it turned my thought just a little bit, and I began to think of recommendation systems, things that are interfaces for commercial sites that suggest things that you might want to buy or use or purchase. As I was working on this story for this month's computer, 2 themes came back that have been central to the Computer Society over the last 6 months or so, and to work that I'm doing with the IEEE on periodicals. Validation and evaluation. In the last 6 months, I began to see the differentiation between the two and realize that making that division is crucial for how we think about information, disseminating information, and talking about it. Validation is a very simple process that says this work was done correctly, as far as I can tell, or not. Valid work follows scientific principles and the standard practices of whatever field it's done in. Evaluation assigns a value. It says this is not only valid, it's highly valuable to the field, to the industry, to me. It expands the field, provides us with a stronger tool. It can be used for commercial purposes. In the past, we combined them, and one of the reasons we did combine them is that journals and other periodicals all had a finite number of pages, and we had more submissions than we could publish. And so we tried to have a very high rejection rate, and that got us the best papers, the ones that we had to judge as most valuable. Well, electronics has changed that a great deal, and it's within our ability to publish every valid paper that comes across our doorstep. Every valid paper, of course, papers that were done correctly, and as far as we can tell, the results are good. Now, some of these are completely without value. They solve a clever little problem. They extend something just a little bit. They take an idea that was used here and developed well and applies it to something else. But it may be worth our while to do that. But if we do it, and I think the open access movement is driving us towards that, we'll have to think about how we evaluate papers for people who need to know that their work was good, that they've done the best sort of thing, that their contribution has actual value. At the end of the day, all the pieces come together, and you have the known world. It's been an interesting ride, and it's something that I've enjoyed immensely. I feel that I've had an opportunity to explore several generations of the computing community. The first period, I spent a lot of time working on the founding generation. Then, for a time, I was writing largely about my own. And now I feel very clearly I'm writing about my students and the rising generation that is taking control of this wonderful and fascinating field. This is David Alan Grier for The Known World and for Computer Magazine. As always, the music for this podcast comes from the Music Alley PodSafe Network, and we thank them very much for their music. Thanks for listening. Take care.